He recalled the momentary weightless feeling of the van flipping on its side before remembering the feeling of his face smashing against the wall and the seatbelt clips between two windows. Luck was on his side, but the inertia flipped him horizontally to the wall, narrowly avoiding being put through the glass before his body made a 45-degree shift, sprawling against the opposite wall, then the next. With each flip, his friends and music gear were tossed like rag dolls against the rolling metal and flying glass. Les began a sequence of repeated scalar notes that seemed to coincide with every flip of the van he could remember. The black Econoline righted itself and made one last crash into the desert sand. 13 times. He had no idea how, but somehow he was able to count the rolls while being tossed around like some kind of masochistic roller coaster. Les coughed and cradled his neck. He wiped the blood away from his face only to see broken amplifiers and instruments were embedded into his friends at angles he could never think possible. Les gathered himself to finally be able to face what had happened. He knew. The silence said everything. He wanted to avoid seeing what had happened. He wanted to avoid seeing what was next. The whole world was at the tips of their fingers, and suddenly, in one moment, all that had changed. Every memory, every string break, every in-joke, every secret that was shared like a family with their own secret language was gone. Les found himself surrounded by the broken pieces of his friends and his dreams. This had to be a dream. It had to. This was not reality. This was not happening. He was going to wake up any moment now. Les tried to squirm one shoulder and he screamed with pain. The feeling of shock sent numbness all through his body and found himself just short of paralyzed. A million thoughts raced through his head as he strenuously reached into his pocket and managed to hit the emergency call button by sliding his thumb, trying to follow where he knew the crack in the corner was. As the shock of it all took over, his body gave up consciousness as the phone could be heard ringing throughout the van that was filled with music and jokes only a minute prior. His fingers picked up tempo as they effortlessly glided up and down the fretboard as he recalled each bump and bruise, digging more and more as he bent into the string, then overbending just to get as close as he could to let out the anguish of those very seconds. It's always the bends. Bends sometimes are like looking into a time capsule that he just happened to live through, good or bad. He finally climaxed with the bend that brought the whole piece to the ever so satisfying resolution. Just as fast, his phone began to vibrate next to him, causing the memory to dissipate, just as the YouTube backing track twanged off and out to allow the incoming call. The letter spelled out Joe Shit the Ragman on the screen, and he already knew what to expect. He held the note and sighed, exhaling a combination of exasperation. His vibrating call begrudgingly refocused his attention. Stretching to elongate his spine, a small tear rolled down his cheek from the pain. He was used to it. But the body's going to do what the body's going to do. Nothing he could do about it. It is what it is. Pain is pain. It doesn't go away. It never will. Just get used to it. He sniffled. Answering the call, Les could hear the voice on the other end sloppily clear his throat and a constant tapping sound in the background.
Hey, Van Halen, think if you could find time to tear yourself away from millions of adoring fans and go get the bags you were supposed to get yesterday? I know you're busy planning your world tour and all, but boss honestly doesn't give a fuck.
Les could hear him greedily vacuuming up a line of disco dust he'd been chopping prior to making the call. At least he knew what the sound was now. Yeah, I'm on it. I was just curious. Once my world tour is over and I'm sitting on a couple bucks, if you want me to buy you some hair plugs, just in case you ever happen to come near a playground in a trench coat, or if you ever need to visit a Chuck E. Cheese, just that kind of thing. The line was silent. I mean, it could save you having to alert your neighbors every time you move somewhere new. Just think on it. My treat.
What the fuck do you even mean?
The voice replied from the other line. Nothing at all, Aqualung. Les chuckled.
What?
The confused thug said, and you got it, Gary Glitter. Les replied, doing his best Sterling Archer impersonation. The worst thing about dumb people is that good jokes just breeze past them, Les thought to himself. Feeling his back stiffen, he winced in pain and slowly peeled the worn leather strap from around his neck. That night ended it all. Since then, every day and night hasn't been the same. The idea he could ever be able to tour again was out of the question. At any time, his injury could snap out of nowhere and an entire string of dates would be canceled. Touring depends on punctuality, after all, and facing that fact, His traveling life playing was essentially over. No promoter would risk lining up shows just for a sudden back spasm to cause a string of cancellations. Ending the call, he half-heartedly flipped through a guitar magazine while rocking back and forth on his obnoxiously squeaky floorboard beside his desk. It had only grown louder since he'd moved in, and they dared not bother the landlord over such a trivial issue for fear of the landlord raising his rent from seeing how Les had transformed raw space into a fairly admirable place where he could make music to his liking. So he knew if that bastard saw the place that he'd raise the rent, kick him out, keep it in the condition it was made into, and rent it out to the next tenant at a substantially higher price. There was no way Les was going to let himself be out on his ass like that. He knew the game. So much to his chagrin, the slightly scuffed floor stayed squeaky. Choosing your battles is a good way to get through life, especially when you're on a budget. Out of his peripherals, his eyes caught the framed photo of the band's first promo shots. You could see the palpable hunger they had. They knew they were firing on all 6 cylinders and were ready to take on the world. The pool hall they stood in front of, now defunct, was the kind of place the factory workers and local rednecks would go to hear bands do their favorite radio covers, only to have them shouting for the football game that was actually on the television in between the clacking of billiard balls. Cigarette smoke mixed with the smell of deep-fried bar food and George Thorogood on the jukebox. Les could specifically remember how more than one guy thought sweatpants was perfectly acceptable attire. That place was a hole, but it was their hole, and it's where they honed their chops. Well, one of the places. Shaking his head and looking sourly over his guitar, but not in a disdainful manner, but more a combination of nostalgia, the kind of thing that Iron Maiden's wasted years are about. He would often sing to himself as a mantra, "Stop wasting time, always searching for those wasted years." He remembered the day he got it. He'd had a few guitars back in the day. Most people have a fondness for their first guitar, but he remembered just how much he couldn't wait to trade it or sell it for something cooler, I guess? That's the word for it? It was the traditional Fender Squire, black and white stereotype that every kid gets for Christmas. He was no exception. After Gibsons, Ibanez, and even Pinnacles of what he called pawn shop tone guitars like Brownsvilles and Kramers, he'd finally found his sound. Finally. Funny enough, it was going to be back to Fender, but this time it was the working guitarist's hammer. The Telecaster. That Telecaster. It survived the wreck. It was the only thing that survived the wreck.